You're listening to the Always Never podcast. In this episode, we dive into the realms of sound, visuals, and music with three extraordinary guests who've left an indelible mark on their respective fields. First up is Phill Brown, a renowned mixing engineer who's worked with a number of legendary musicians, including the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, Bob Marley, and Talk Talk, to name but just a few. Next, we're joined by James Marsh, a graphic artist whose visual imagination has graced album covers, posters, and beyond. His collaborations with musicians has become iconic in their own right, adding a visual dimension to the auditory experience. Completing our trio is Robert Dean, formerly of the groundbreaking band Japan. As a guitarist and songwriter, Robert played a pivotal role in shaping the band's innovative sound during the new wave and post-punk era. Together, Phill Brown, James Marsh, and Robert Dean provide unique perspectives on the collaborative spirit that fuels creativity, offering listeners an immersive journey into the worlds of audio engineering, visual artistry, and musical innovation. Let's go. Thank you very much for joining me on the Always Never podcast, episode number 1. I started off with a bang because I've got three amazing guests, Mr. Robert Dean, Mr. James Marsh, and Mr. Phill Brown. How are you guys doing?
Very well, thank you.
Very well.
It's amazing to see all of you on the screen. As I said, we all worked on this project. The track Always Never, but really it's become a project. It's become more than one track. So I wanted to, I had some questions prepared for each of you, but I want this to be a group discussion. So I was going to ask Phill, can you share a bit about your musical history and how you got started? But I want to ask all of you that. So if I could start with Phill, did you grow up in a musical family?
Not particularly. My mother played piano, but I was lucky. I got an older brother, Terry Brown, who is in Canada. He ended up doing Rush, but he was 3 years older than me. He got a job at Olympic when it was in Baker Street before they moved to Barnes. So I know 64 or something like that. So as a kid, 13, 14-year-old, I used to go up at weekends and things and sit in on sessions. So I watched the Yardbirds record and Marianne Faithfull and PJ Proby, these kind of people. But I met the Keith Grant who ran the place. And then, when I was about 16, pretty cocky, I just asked, I said, I want a job. I got a job as a tape op. And about 3 months later, he phoned me up. So I started at Olympic when it had moved to Barnes in 67, working mainly for him, but then under Glyn Johns, Eddie Kramer. So it's a fantastic education. So that's how I kind of started.
Wow. I mean, it's funny, you mentioned PJ Proby. Immediately I thought that was one of my mum's favorites. She loved him. Obviously my dad was in the Pretty Things and she got to meet lots of artists, but I do remember her talking about him. So James, did you grow up with a piano in the house?
No musical background as far as I'm concerned. And I don't play any instruments either. I never really sort of had a desire to do it. Well, in so much as that, once I'd set my mind on the course I was going, there wasn't really time to do anything else. And I've always felt that going to really do one thing well. So I never really wanted to try and take on too many things. It's a full-time job doing whatever you do, really.
Absolutely. But was there music in the house? Were your parents listening to the Beatles or?
Well, when I grew up, as a kid, anyway, no, there weren't any musical instruments, and I come from quite a sort of poor background, I suppose, but I wasn't aware of that. I don't even think we had a radio when I was a kid. And it was before television. So, it shows my age, I suppose. It was only until the 60s, I suppose, or the late 50s, that we had a television in the house.
Okay.
But my first musical memories were all about listening to the Radio Luxembourg in particular, where you could sort of tune into these weird channels. It was always quite a mystery to me. And I used to listen in bed at night to sort of, these sounds, tuning in, because it was a very delicate process, getting the right station. And that I used to do that at night, quietly. I had a big radio set that was we'd sort of upgraded to something better, put it that way. And it was an old-fashioned 50s radio that I had. That was my first musical education, I suppose.
I can totally relate to the Radio Luxembourg. It was me, my cat, and a little radio under the covers, listening to John Peel and Radio Luxembourg. So can I turn that question slightly to the right? Were your parents artistic?
No, I never had anything like that to inspire me. I'm not really sure where it came from. I suppose I'm just the sort of black sheep of the family, really.
Well, I knew we had something in common. So Robert.
Yes.
Were your parents musical?
No. We did have a piano.
Okay.
Which my sister, who's 4 years older than me, she learned the piano. It was never suggested that I learn the piano. Don't know why. I was always better at it than she was anyway, and But yeah, we had a piano, and we had a little record player, and my mum and dad had a few records, mainly like Elvis and Perry Como and stuff like that. When I was very little, I remember that. But I mean, it was really like, we had a TV, and once the Beatles started, it was very galvanizing to watch them on TV, because they were on quite a lot in the early 60s, weren't they, really? And that was my, that was the start of it for me, really.
Okay.
Through my sister, because, she was at an age where she was old enough to be more into music than I was, but it bled from her. She was also into like the Beach Boys, Otis Redding, and the soul acts, Aretha Franklin, and all that stuff. So I gleaned a lot from her, and then found my own path.
Okay. So did any of those early bands and artists that you listened to, probably not Perry Como, but did any of those kind of influence your later work?
Only the Beatles, really.
Gotcha.
I mean, the Beatles is the biggest influence on me as a musician, for sure.
Fair enough.
Just like the economy of everything they did, and the melodic sense is something that's always stayed with me.
Gotcha. All right. I should at this point say that you played guitar on Always Never. James did an amazing job on the artwork. And of course, Phill did a stellar job on the mix. I did want to point that out. So, James, this is for you. How do you approach the challenge of translating music into visual arts? And what is your creative process?
Well, it's not, I don't have a particular sort of set way of doing things. I always approach everything with an open mind, really. And I suppose in your case, it was fairly straightforward, in so much as that I had the sort of set thing of the California West Coast vibe that I felt was the thing to try and focus on. In the previous stuff we'd done prior to that, there was the similar thing with Orange County. So that gave me that color thing. So it's really just trying to do that in a very stylized, not an obvious way, just to kind of set the scene or the mood for that. It depends what I'm doing. Sometimes you try and sort of set the vibe for the music, or sometimes you're representing a particular theme or something that's within the context of the album.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's probably my main approach to it, was just
and presumably
California West Coast vibe to it.
And presumably the artists give you kind of a suggestion, like where to go, or do they leave it totally up to you?
I've been lucky in most cases. People usually come to me and give me a free hand with what I'm doing. But I've kind of set out to do that in a way. I think if you put out, the work you put out tends to be what you get back. And it's pretty much, I never really wanted to be pigeonholed. So I work in different areas, and that suits me really. So I don't mind working for different genres of music. In fact, I prefer it rather than just sticking to one path. And it's better to be more varied. It keeps you fresh and creative, really. So I always thought I'm happy with what I'm doing, and I don't get pigeonholed. It used to be a big thing of mine, pigeonholing. I've done various business cards over the years which have been based on that idea, pigeonholes. So I've always tried to avoid that wherever possible.
Yeah. All right. I have to ask you. So, talking about creating artwork, can I ask you about the first Talk album? Because your work is synonymous, really, with their. You can't think of their music or image without thinking of those iconic covers that you created. So I'm curious about, were the band involved? Did you meet them? Did they give you free rein? Were you given a brief? Could you speak about that?
I did meet the band a couple of times in the early days, and then a bit later on, I dealt with Mark. But it sort of transpired that the record company were quite happy for Keith Aston, the manager, who was a personal friend of mine, which is how I kind of got involved in the first place. We just met one weekend, and he told me about this band he was thinking about managing, and his dilemma was how to present them. He didn't know quite how to do that. But all he knew was they didn't want to be represented as in the usual way that people were represented in the 80s, I suppose. Bands like, and they definitely didn't want to align themselves with bands like Duran Duran, where mostly it was pretty boy images on the cover, photographic. And so I suppose it was an antidote to that. So he gave me the idea. I said I'd go away and think about it. And my first thoughts were quite straightforward to me. I just wanted to represent the band's name, Talk. That's how the lips, the mouth, the eyes came about. Initially, it was more like, I was thinking about it more like a logo, I suppose. And then when that went down well, it sort of led to other albums and singles from that, within that format, I suppose. I wanted it to be a bit more connected than it transpired, but things being the way they are, there was certain things got in the way, like certain singles were wanted at the drop of a hat because of the success initially. And I think what happened was I was on holiday and there wasn't time, so I presented images that I already had for things down the line. So it wasn't always straightforward, but I always presented things that I thought would work together. And being illustrated by me, I suppose there was that that connection. So it worked out okay in the end.
Yeah, amazing.
I'll probably miss something out there. Did you ask me something else about? That's how I started with it, anyway.
Gotcha. Go ahead, Robert.
There's a distinct surreal element to your work. Were you influenced by, like surrealist artists, or in particular, or who influenced you?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in the surrealists, and I suppose that that came about in the 60s as well. There was it started appearing in advertising in the 60s. I've done a lot of pastiche work with different artists, by request. And yes, I've been influenced by them for sure as a group of artists, but I never really wanted to try and emulate anyone.
Right,
I mean, the real surrealist ethos is quite different to my take on it, but visually there's that connection. But I suppose it was a 60s thing. There's always been that kind of surrealist humor came in the 60s, didn't it, really, with everything. And so I think it's just part of my background, really. By default, almost, in a way.
Yeah, I mean,
the Goons were on the radio in the 50s and 60s, and you couldn't really get more surreal than that in humor.
That's true. Yeah, and also at the same time, you had companies like Hypnosis who were very much surrealist based too. I guess that was the trend in those days. In the early 70s.
They came a bit later, didn't they, really?
Yeah, but, a little bit later.
Yeah, there's always been that. Yeah. No, it's not really gone away. I mean, you still see the surrealistic aspect coming through in advertising today.
Yeah, that's true.
I think Spike Milligan was one of my favorites as far as that goes.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Phill, so tell me about your process. So when you got the stems for Always Never, I presume all the faders were at 0. So what do you bring up first? And what, I know every project is different, but what informs your decisions from there on in?
I guess when I first start, I do set up some spaces, I guess reverbs or repeats or, air. So I do have some, I do that because, so I can try out different things straight away rather than like bring up instruments and then have to do all that. I kind of do that first. But I nearly always start with drums. I'm very old fashioned in that way. So get a drum sound or, tweak that, positioning, panning. Then bass, I'm very methodical in that kind of old school way. Being that the word vocals in a way makes it a lot easier anyway. I mean, I have been known to almost start with a vocal, but have the vocal up there and get it in its space and then bring in instruments around it. I'm a bit like James. I don't have a real fixed formula, to be honest with you. I kind of still try to approach each track that I'm hearing or sent or mixing as a kind of one-off. I mean, there's obviously things I do automatically just because I've been doing it so long, but I don't really work to a formula. There's little tricks that I do with drums where I send all the drums to I don't compress the drums themselves, but I send a feed of the drums to a mono compressor and then bring that up as part of the drum kit, because that way I can still have a live, real sounding kit, but have this energy or this kind of messed up element going on in there as well. Initially just getting drum sound, bass, guitars, the keyboards, spaces. So getting sounds and panning are the first kind of things I do. And then when it's down to just a balancing thing, that's in a way the kind of fun side of it. You can just
I'm interested in this mono compressor though, as opposed to a stereo. Why would you choose that?
I tend to work with a lot of monos, but moving them into the stereo picture. So you still get kind of a big stereo, but I'm not into this stereo recording thing, because you do stereo, guitars, say, and then maybe keyboards and things, and it all ends up being a kind of wide mono. So I like, I do like, say, maybe the keyboards to be off to one side, or 10 o'clock, balance up with, say, the guitarist over here. I just work with monos. But a year 1176 set up, on maximum, all buttons in, fast attack, fast release. If you listen to it on its own, it's atrocious. It's pumping and dirty and all the rest of it. But when you slide it in behind your pristine kit, it just adds energy. It also adds depth. That's the one thing that, this is what I was talking to Paul yesterday, but it bugs me with digital that it's very hard to get depth. And the wonderful thing about analog, especially tape, if you record to tape, is that you automatically get this depth, this 3D thing happening. Digital always sounds like everything's here. So I spend a bit of time in that sense trying to get space and room and depth. I do like things to go back into the speaker.
Amazing. Do they have the option to do tape at Echo Zoo?
Yeah, he's got loads of tape. He's got 16 track, 2 inches, 24 track, half inch. There's a lot of tape there. Yeah.
Good to know. Yeah. Thank you. So, Robert, how do you approach collaborations and sessions? So, when I sent you the stems, you were very kind to listen to them, and you told me, "Hey, I'll listen. I'll see what I can do." So, how did you approach that session?
It was very much solid keyboards, really, right at that point, and so my instinct was to create atmospheric sounds that would fit in, but not sound like keyboards. That's basically it. Using EBO to me is it's quite easy to put it into a track. It doesn't necessarily get lost, but it also doesn't impose. That's the way I feel about it when I put EBO on the track, and it lends itself quite easily to something like Always Never, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you brought the EBO up, because I wanted to ask you about that. So growing up, you and Bill Nelson really, for me, were the two people that used EBO that were a big influence. They made me buy an EBO. Wasn't very good at it as a teenager, but later on in life I bought one and I'm okay. So who influenced you? Let's backtrack. So how did you discover the EBO?
In recording, I always found it difficult to create long sustained sounds on a guitar. I didn't have like a huge Marshall stack with, feedback for days. I had a fairly small setup, in those days. I guess it was, I'm presuming I had a Roland Jazz Chorus by that point. I'm not sure. But I basically had a combo amp, and I wasn't into cranking up and getting feedback and all that stuff. So my only thing to resort to was pedals. And in those days, although pedals were being developed at a fast pace, there still really wasn't like a really great infinite sustain pedal, really. Right. You just had to keep experimenting. And often I found like fuzz pedals in those days, they tended to sound pretty thin. When they were put in a track, they were like really thin. They didn't have this thickness. Fripp had this thickness, but he got it through basically because he used like Marshall stacks and stuff, and huge big sound. So I was always looking for something to do that. And, I used to get all the guitar mags and stuff, and then I saw it advertised in one of them, I think, Infinite Sustain. I'm not even sure if I noticed that Bill Nelson was using it at that point. Maybe I had, I don't know. But there wasn't, as you say, there wasn't really anybody else.
Yeah, well, I asked you the other day if Fripp was using one on Heroes, and you told me no.
He never used an EBO.
Wow.
So it was basically my way of getting thick sustain, and it worked for me because that's what I want. He was basically my hero in those days as far as recording, with people like Bowie and Peter Gabriel, and
right.
He was, to me, he was the only one who was doing anything really, really challenging and interesting.
I mean, you've worked with so many amazing musicians, and so has Phill, and I'm sure James.
Phil's worked with a lot more than I have.
Well, we'll get to that maybe. We've only got 90 minutes, so let's see how we go.
Yeah.
But I would be remiss, and honestly, he'd be mad at me if I didn't ask about not Japan. You'd be surprised to know, but Sinead O'Connor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, can you tell me about that? How did you meet her? How was, because you worked on the debut album, is that correct?
Yeah.
Could you tell me about...
I worked with Sinead for about a bit more than a year, I think, in general. But how we met was kind of funny. I was working with this band in the West Country, which I hated. I won't.
Hopefully, they're not listening.
I won't give just the situation I hated. The band had some interesting things going on, but for a living and working situation, it was not great. And so every weekend I'd go back to London to get away from Trowbridge in Wiltshire. Don't recommend anybody goes to Trowbridge.
Sorry, listeners, if you live there.
Yeah, sorry about that. But if they do, they know what I mean. And I was back in London, and I had this friend, Ali McMordy, who was the bass player with Stiff Little Fingers. And he was working on some demos with Sinead. I'd never heard of Sinead. Nobody had. And he played me some of her stuff. And I just said, I really love this, if ever there's an opportunity that I can work on it, please let me know. He said, well, we have a guitarist at the moment, but if anything happens, I'll let you know. In the meantime, I went back to Wiltshire, and I bumped into two members of the Psychedelic Furs, the Butler brothers. And they invited me, they asked if I would be interested in doing a tour, doing their next tour. And I turned them down. Within a few days, I got a call from my friend Ali in London, and he said, well, the guitarist that we were using just got the gig with the Psychedelic Furs. So if you want to work with Sinead, the gig's yours. So I dropped everything, left Wiltshire, and went to London and
like you would.
Yeah, and met Sinead, and it was an absolutely fabulous time. She was absolutely wonderful, one of the best people I've worked with.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, she was very green to a certain extent, determined, but very young, green, and the band, we all kind of like looked after her. She was like this little girl that we kind of looked after, and we would book out like a rehearsal studio for like 3 months at a time and go in every day and work on material and stuff, do demos and all that, which eventually became the album The Lion and the Cobra.
So was she signed at the point when you joined?
Yes, she was signed to Ensign Records. which had the Water Boys and World Party.
Okay, yep, I remember them. And you co-wrote some songs, correct?
Just one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. So, Phill, we have to talk about some of the legendary acts you've worked with. It's a laundry list, I guess. We could say, who haven't you worked with? To be quite honest, probably the same with James as well. I mean, who haven't you worked with? But there's two I want to talk about, and it's not the obvious one, I don't think. Roxy Music and David Bowie. I'm interested in those.
Well, they're pretty obvious, aren't they? I mean, geez.
Well, I mean, amongst the his CV, I mean, come on now. You got Hendrix. I could have talked about the Stones. I could have talked about Zeppelin. I could have talked about Susie Quatro. This man is responsible for Can the Can. You know that, right?
I was that in the book? I can't remember.
It probably wasn't. I mean, the editor did a great job, but probably took out.
Okay.
But I did. Yeah, Can the Can. I at Ireland, when I was a house engineer, I ended up doing quite a lot of those Mickey Mouse, Chinny Chat records.
So that was all Rack Studios, yeah.
I did it at Island Basin Street, but she was she was with Mickey. If they couldn't work there, they'd come and work with me. And I did the Sweet and Mud and Susie Quatro.
Oh man, right. That's a whole different podcast.
But I mean, the thing is, it's just been. I mean, I don't believe the list either. You know what I mean? I look at the list and go, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's just been a lot of luck. I mean, obviously, a lot of 100-hour weeks.
You should buy a lottery ticket, mate. I'm telling you.
But you also work with Little Feat, which is one of my favorite 70s.
I know,
bands.
one of my favorite ones.
Loved them.
Yeah,
so enjoyable. Richie Hayward was just a gem, and obviously Lowell, but tricky. But I mean, brilliant band to work with.
Amazing.
I mean, all those projects. I mean, Robert Palmer, although we had 4 albums out before he had a hit, which I mean these days you probably couldn't do too much to do that. But
you definitely couldn't.
No, but he was the one that allowed us to end up working with these kind of artists and musicians. Yeah. The LA, although I didn't enjoy LA as much as places like New Orleans or Baltimore and that, but working with James Jameson was one of my high points, I must admit. But back to the Bowie thing, I did one thing with Bowie way back, early 70s, when it was a track called Holy Holy. It was produced by that bass player, Herbie Flowers.
Oh, Herbie Flowers, yeah.
So it was his kind of band, and they would, I never really took Bowie too seriously, I must admit. I mean, I know I'm probably in a minority, but I ended up knowing him socially and knew Angie Bowie well. He was a clever guy. I mean, I'm not taking any of that away from him, but he was very good at kind of taking ideas or things that had already been done and then putting his slant on it and making it sound like it's unique and never been done before. So he was quite clever with that. But I mean, I can't say that I particularly was that bothered about this track we were working on. He didn't communicate too much. He was dressed like a highwayman. I just didn't really take him too seriously.
I mean, I can see, early 70s, he hadn't made any sort of impact yet. So he was still finding himself too, I think.
He brought out quite some pretty kind of, crazy records. And he sang like Anthony Newley. And that's something, and again, I've never understood why. He and it's true. I mean, people that know him said he just loved Anthony Newley, but he kind of modelled himself on that. So I must admit, I didn't take him too seriously. And then I was staying at his apartment in the Sherry Netherland in New York with Angie Bowie, Danny Gillespie, Mick Jagger, a whole load of people. And but by then he had made it. This was 76, 77.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of stuff with Visconti. So I got, certain bits of information or just approach from him.
Cool.
But no, Bowie, I know some people absolutely adore him. Don't mind either way.
Well, as time goes on, I think it's the impact gets even more, now he's not with us, it just kind of makes it all the more impactful.
I mean, the last album I did think was astounding. I mean, that's
it was astounding.
So weird. I mean, I do have his albums. Some I actually really liked. Some I just didn't really get into. I liked Let's Dance, although he hated it. It seems. I mean, he wasn't pleased with the album, but I think it's a pretty cool album. But the last album is it's remarkable.
It is remarkable. Yeah.
So
I agree.
I'm not undermining him. It's just that I just wasn't a really true blue fan.
Sure.
And who was Roxy Music? Was that the other one?
Yes, sir. Well, I want to ask you about the Mark's solo album, but we can save that for later. But yes, Roxy Music.
Yeah, Roxy was, I mean, I got to work with them when they just reformed, having split up. So it was like late 70s, 79 maybe. I'd done a couple of solo albums with Andy Mackay.
Yeah.
I'd worked with the other musicians in the band. I did even work with Brian Ferry on a session when he was doing a solo thing. But I actually left those sessions because that again, it was just like this. I just couldn't take the guy seriously. I don't think he's a very good singer. And he was all about the illusion, if you know what I mean. He had to have a little table with his cigarettes and and it was all just so precious. And at Island Studios, we were quite a rock and roll bunch of dopeheads, I guess, and Island Studios, it just wasn't that kind of environment, to take too seriously. So I did a week or so with him and Chris Hughes, but it wasn't my kind of thing. So I left that. But then when the Roxy reformed, I think it was partly Andy Mackay and Phil Manzanera who suggested that I get brought in. And at that point, Alan Spencer was playing bass and Paul Carrick was playing keyboards. And they were all people that I knew and kind of hung out with. So I was.
So was that a Manifesto?
Manifesto.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
We did at Ridge Farm and there was no control room there. I mean, I've worked in these kind of places since then and even did my own album in that environment, but we just all were in the same room. So a barn, basically, before Ridge Farm was properly built into a studio. But we had a lot of fun there. I mean, a lot of jams and just working out on riffs and things that structured the album. So, and if you listen to it, there's obviously 4 or 5 very proper constructed songs, if you like. But tracks like Manifesto, you can kind of tell it's come out of a kind of
sure,
great bunch of musicians, and it was kind of fun to do. But I only, I didn't even mix it. I was going to mix it, and then I had to go into hospital, and I recommended that they use Rhett Davis, and then Rhett kind of went on to do the next kind of 5.
Yeah, he did all of it. Yeah. And the Ferry albums.
Boys and Girls, right?
Yeah.
Which is a particular favorite of mine. I have to say my favorite Bowie album is Pin-Ups, but that's only because he covered 2 of my dad's songs. So I should put that out there. And this whole world is very small because Twiggy appears on that album cover. And I dated a girl whose mum was the receptionist at Leonard's, which is the hairdresser that worked with Twiggy. So I'm presuming he did the hair on that album cover as well. One other story is my dad left the Pretty Things. This must have been early 70s. My grandfather was like, this is very twee and very 60s, but you guys might be able to relate to this. He said, there's no way that the Pendleton name should be associated with rock and roll. So he was kind of forced out the band. He forced to leave, get a normal job. When the 2, I think my dad answered an ad, classic case of answering an ad in Melody Maker, and Phil May and Dick Taylor, exactly. The singer and the lead guitarist of the Pretty Things turn up at my dad's house, and my grandmother answered, and she said, "Brian, there's a couple of gypsies wanting you." She thought that he'd gone to the fair and caused a ruckus, and that they were they were there to dish out whatever. But
that is an attitude, I think, though, of that era, because early 70s, I had my first #1 single with Without You, and I was over the moon. And my parents were like, yeah, it's all very well, but when are you going to get a proper job? You know? They never really took what Terry and I did as I mean, over time, they obviously realized, oh, they seem to have done all right, you know. But at the time, it was, I mean, worse for my brother because he gave up a proper job at JWT advertising to go into it. But yeah, it's kind of disheartening when you've got a number one record like that and somebody goes, yeah, but when are you going to get a proper job? It's like, all I can do one thing quite well. It's basically
Yeah, I have to say, my dad wasn't the greatest father in the world, but he was an amazing guitarist. So anyway, if you can imagine Beckenham High Street, early 70s, my dad's walking down the street, and then he is behind him, this guy go, Brian, hey, Brian, turns around. Now, this story is related to me by my mum. My dad was a bit like my grandfather. So my grandfather fought in the Second World War. He fought in North Africa with Montgomery. But during the rest of his life, he never talked about the war. And just like my grandfather, my dad never talked about being in the band. It was like, that was then, this is now. So all these stories are from my mum, God bless her. So, Dad's walking down Beckenham High Street and hears this voice, Brian, turns around, it's Bowie. Now, they were friends, hadn't seen each other for a while. And Bowie goes, well, I'm organising this music workshop. Do you want to come join me? Now, I don't know if this was kind of an unofficial audition for Ziggy. I don't know what this was about. But my dad said no. And I always wonder if my dad had said yes, what the hell would have happened from there on in? Could he have become a spider from Mars? I don't know.
Who knows?
We'll never know.
I'll never know. Well, you know, neither of them are sadly not with us, so I can't ask either of them. So there we go.
It reminds me of the sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It reminds me of when I first came to London, and my first job was with record company, and which is Pyre Records, by the way. And then I moved quickly from there to Decca Records, and Decca Records have become famous for turning down the Beatles. They did sign the Stones,
sure had.
But that was their claim to fame.
Yeah, guitar band.
It reminded me of that.
Yeah.
When you said, think about your father.
It's a bit like EMI, you know, the Sex Pistols were signed to them for about a week. Was it Polydor? I can't remember.
No, it was EMI.
Was it EMI? Yeah, they took the money and ran. I mean, you can't blame them. All right. So this is a question for all of you. The music industry and visual arts have undergone a significant change over the year. How have you all adapted to these changes? And I know, Phil, you don't work in the box, do you? You don't work in a computer. It's all outboard.
No. I obviously use Pro Tools, but I just can't mix with a mouse. That's the problem I have.
That's a T-shirt right there. I can't mix with a mouse.
And I'd say, listening to Paul's things yesterday, I mean, he often, the first Rusty Man album, I was kind of going out and seeing him, and we were talking about stuff. He'd play me stuff. I'd go out 3 years later and he would give me the update. You know, it took him 10 years. But this project he's working on, he's probably been on this a couple of years, but whatever he's done, he's made samples and digital and all the rest of it just feels so real.
Wow.
I mean, you can see this band in front of you. You know, he's been clever to basically put in mistakes and things, if you know what I mean, to grunge it up a bit, so it isn't all pristine. Because the big problem I have with modern music is that it's all just too perfect. You know, everything's just perfect, and for me, it has no life. It has no soul. It's just plastic. It's brilliant. You know, I listen to things and go, "Wow, I couldn't do that. That's fantastic." But after 2 minutes or the next track comes on, it's like, wow, this is boring. You know, it's just, and the technology, which is brilliant, it allows us to do this for a start. Martin Ditcham, who lives in Brazil, we can send out tapes, Ether, a track, he can put some percussion on, send it back. I mean, all of that side of it, I think, is brilliant. But I've tried. I just cannot mix in the box. I have to have it on a desk in front of me that I can kind of play. I mean, I do, you know, it's a lot of it's back to because I learned on 4-track and then 8-track and, you know, a manual mixing all through the 70s. So all that stuff you talk about, whether it was, you know, whether it is Jeff Beck, Sly Stone, Led Zeppelin, whatever, Bob Marley, you know, it's all live mixing. And I loved live mixing because, again, it was another performance in a way. And you get things when you do that, which are mistakes perhaps, or you hadn't intended to, but it's fantastic. But when 80s came along and the SSL and everything's put in and you kind of do your ride and then that's printed and that's it forever kind of thing. That took me a long time to adjust to because it wasn't my kind of way of working.
Yeah.
But I eventually kind of got there and, you know, I didn't really enjoy the 80s particularly musically as much or with the technology. For me, the 70s was just a remarkable kind of decade. The 90s I liked because there was anything was possible in the 90s, it seems. You know, there's a real fusion of different styles and different gear and everything being thrown together. So the 90s I found exciting again. Because we kind of got a bit away from click tracks and synthy code and everything being locked. And I hate when I see people, I mean, if I do work on Pro Tools, I don't have the screen anywhere near me. I have it wherever. I'm not interested. I want to watch it because it's addictive. And I don't do edits by visual thing. You know, I'm used to the razor blade, but I mean, you can edit, but I do it by how you hear things. And back to Talk Tom in the Spirit of Eden album, you know, we were working with, you know, 5 24-track tape machines and a Mitsubishi 32-track digital, all kind of synced up and offsets and things. And we could, if something was played in a particular place, and we were in the dark, so we're in pitch black, got no screen, all you've got is what you can hear. And if somebody played something which was brilliant but in the wrong place, we would, you know, offset everything and move it to where we thought we wanted it. But it was, again, timing was all done through, Mark would just kind of go there, you know, and we'd work out the maths and do it that way.
There must have been an incredible amount of tracks.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. Admittedly, it eventually ended up on 32 tracks of Mitsubishi and 48 tracks or 46 tracks of analog. That was the albums. But getting there, we had 5 slave reels for ideas or for takes, which if we liked something, we would then bounce it across. On After the Flood, which is on Laughing Stock, which is one of my favorite tracks. I can't listen to the album, but that track, there's over 100 tracks of analog chaos, you know, which is, you know, everything's mono again. So you've got 1 track of drums or 2 tracks of drums, maybe 3 or 4 Hammonds on there, maybe a couple of pianos, 4 or 5 guitars, 3 or 4 basses, all, you know, but it's 20 instruments. So all these other tracks are air conditioning units or boiling kettles or recording steam. I mean, to create this absurd atmospherics. And for me, that track I find remarkable still. I mean, the bass is stunning.
Do you hear a steaming kettle when you listen?
No, that's the wonderful thing about, I mean, it was so involved and took so long to do and all the rest of it that admittedly, you know, Tim and I, neither of us listened to the albums probably for a year or 2 after we'd had them mastered at Abbey Road. It wasn't something you kind of kept putting on. But after that time, you kind of forgot exactly what was what. So if it was was it a real trumpet or was it the Variophone or was it, you know, a Leslie thing that was going, because we kept lots of mistakes and lots of stuff that technically you would have got rid of. So we got rid of a lot of the brilliant stuff because it was too good, as Mark used to say. That was his catchphrase, sounds too good.
Wow. Too polished, right?
It's madness. It really was.
So, you know, I
don't know if I question now.
No, it did. I'm learning to keep things simple, but from hearing you talk, I'm also learning that you should keep mistakes in.
Well, I think if it's the right mistake,
right.
There's a mistake. In fact, on one of Bowie's albums, there's a bass note It's not. I can't even remember what it is now, obviously. But no, not. You need things have to sound real to me. You know,
Yeah.
I want to be able to see the band there. So I don't. You know, if it's the right kind of mistake, or if the feel is so good, and this little error, it's like, who knows?
Well, getting back to the Beatles, I mean, there are so many mistakes, very audible mistakes on a lot of their stuff, you know, or like glitches and drop-ins and all that stuff, but it all adds up to something special.
I like all that
you
stuff.
need to get things from experimenting, don't you? You know, you could call them mistakes, but by experimenting, that's how you move on and find new things.
Yeah, exactly.
And with music and with art, you know, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, James, I want to get onto you, but briefly, Phill, you mentioned you can't listen to that album in full, and I know you've talked about this before, but could you just briefly tell me why?
I think, I mean, working on Spirit of Eden was kind of great fun in a way. I mean, it was mad, but it was such an adventure and it was so exciting. And I'd never worked on anything like that really in my life. And to be given the kind of freedom that they gave you, for an engineer, it was just brilliant. You could put up any mic you wanted. You could build some ridiculous tube to put a guitar amp down and all these. And I did the same. I was accusing Bowie of, but I mean, I took ideas that Pete Townsend had when I saw him recording years ago, where he built a kind of, you know, with screens and mattresses on the top. So he had this huge, great tunnel, and they put an amp at one end at phenomenal volume and the mic at the other. And I really kind of, you know, we tried that out and used it on Mark's guitar. But Spirit was fun. When we came to do Laughing Stock, I think the timing was right. I don't think Mark should have been in the studio really at that point. I mean, it's easy in hindsight because his brother had just died. His wife had been very ill, and we were kind of in the studio in the dark again with the strobe lights and the oil projectors and all that kind of world. But it wasn't like going back to Spirit of Eden. And the other thing that Mark and Tim is that we couldn't do anything that we'd done on Spirit of Eden, whether it was mics or whatever. We couldn't use those again. So suddenly you're presented with, okay, that's why we end up with one mic on the drums, you know, because I used the Neumann head on Spirit of Eden, but we couldn't use all the stuff that we'd done on Spirit of Eden. So, and Laughing Stock was just difficult. It was very dark. The kind of humor that Mark had, which rubbed off on Tim, but that humor became quite dark and bullying, I think. You know, again, in hindsight, Lee was given a terrible time on drums. You know, poor guy in the end ends up there on his own, you know, with Martin Ditcham in a cupboard with a shaker because they didn't want a click track, but they wanted a click track. And it took, you know, a similar amount of time. It was almost a year. Mark often didn't say much. We erased maybe 90%, if not more, of what we recorded. So you never felt that you knew where you were headed, if you know what I mean. It was like you'd record something which you would think was fantastic. Yeah. And 2 days later, it'd be like, can you erase that? You know, or just keep that bit, you know? So it was this thing where it was like one step, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the time.
Yeah.
And I just find the album, I had a difficult time after the album, as a lot of us did. I mean, say Tim got divorced. Lee had a really tough time. Paul had already left the band by that point. And it was really Tim, Mark and I that spent most of the time in the control room on our own working on it. The assistant left the business. I mean, there was a lot of carnage at the end of that. And the problem is, and I did it a few months back because somebody asked me about something on one of the tracks. When I put the album on, it only takes 5 or 6 minutes and I'm back in that headspace and that atmosphere, and it just isn't healthy for me. Yeah. So after the flood, I do listen to After the Flood because I can deal with that one, and I also find it remarkable. But I mean, New Grass is a great example. You know, I wouldn't listen to New Grass for 15 years. Right? And then eventually when somebody basically forced me to listen to it, I went, wow, this is really beautiful. But that's not my memory when I tried mixing it, and we took 10 days mixing this track. You know, in the end, you can't really hear what you're doing. It's just like white noise. You know, it all sounds crazy, but I mean, none of us were ever the same after those albums. That's the thing, positive and negative. You know, I learned
so much. Time when there was all sorts of legal stuff going on as well.
Sorry, a lot of
legal.
Was that the time when there was a lot of legal stuff going on with? Because that probably, you know, was affecting Mark, I'm sure.
Yeah, we had the EMI court case between Spirit of Eden and Laughingstock, and he signed to Polydor basically as Mark Hollis, not really as Talk Talk, for 2 albums. And when we finished Laughing, and it's Lucien Grange, who's the bane of my life. He runs Universal now in America, but he was running Polydor. And when we delivered the album, he basically turned around to somebody and said, "Oh man, I thought they made Spirit of Eden to get out of their contract with EMI." Right? He never got the album. So you had all these people signing or taking on Talk Talk and getting something they completely didn't expect. I mean, even me, I loved Colour of Spring. I mean, it was the album of '86, you know, perhaps one of the best albums of the '80s. And when I got the gig of doing this next album, I thought, oh, I'm going to be doing Colours of Spring Part 2. This is going to be wonderful. You know? And then suddenly we're off, you know, in the dark with oil projectors doing so we were all thrown by it. But obviously EMI businessmen, Lucien Grange, is, you know, they don't see it that way. They just think, well, we've given you this £400,000 to make a record, and this is unsaleable. The one thing that I don't, that's why I won't forgive Lucien Grange really, but it was released in England. 3 months later, it was deleted.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Why you would do that, I have no idea. It was obviously, you could get it in America, but you couldn't get it here. And if you're a businessman, which, I mean, that's basically what he is, why would you spend 400,000 on something and then not give it a chance?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Well, it's proved to be a classic album over time, hasn't it? But I understand it wasn't considered a commercial success at the time. Yeah.
No, they both were totally uncommercial, really. And I Believe in You, we kind of edited down into a single for Spirit of Eden, which kind of messed up the track a bit, really. It worked time-wise, but it didn't make sense musically as much. And Mark always regretted doing it. But there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that was very, very negative, basically from record companies, and it did used to affect Mark. You know, he could shake things off and make a joke out of it because of his kind of attitude to humor. But, you know, those things do, you know, can you imagine what it's like when you've just put all that energy and work into an album and you get one guy at Polydor saying, I can't stay in the same room as this album, although now I do understand what he's saying. And then you get Lucien Grange saying, you know, did you make Spirit of Eden to get it? They just didn't get any of it. It took us all a long time to just get over that, I suppose. And then, you know, Mark's solo album, which was done very, very differently to any of the other records, but that at least was accepted as a record. There weren't negative comments about that.
Yeah, that was an amazing piece of work, obviously. I read today that was initially going to be the last Talk Talk album. Is that true?
It was originally called Mountains of the Moon, I think it was originally going to be called. But then Mark realized, you know, basically said, well, look, you know, Lee's not playing on it. Paul's already left. It's not a Talk Talk record. It was all, apart from Dominic Miller and Robbie McIntosh and Martin Ditcham, those three, everyone else were, you know, session players, if you like. Clarinet section or, you know, woodwind section and all the kind of names that we went through, people like Steve Gadd, were all erased because they weren't good enough for what Mark was after. And I mean, that album was made with just 2 mics, you know, so we recorded the whole thing on just two old valves.
How long did it take?
That took about 6 months. But it was, you know, it was daylight, it was bright lights, it was music. We even had demos, you know. Mark had played me up in Suffolk ages before. He'd played me a finished album, basically, without lyrics. where he'd made everything with samples.
Yeah.
So then it got scored out so that real people would come in and play. But he's such a perfectionist, so there might be one little thing that's not quite right. And it's a weird, it's so contradictory, Mark, because he loved mistakes and he would put in mistakes.
Yeah.
And if somebody did a mistake that wasn't the kind of mistake he liked, you know what I mean? So he would go on and on. And he might live with something for a month and think it's great. And then he'd come back in and go, no, that's rubbish. We erase it. They're coming in at 2. We're doing it again.
Wow. Yeah, I guess one of the problems is when you're given free rein like that, you can't stop yourself, It
can go horribly wrong, can't it?
Yeah, of course.
My attitude over Spirit of Eden, considering the way we did it and the 350 grand and the 11 months or whatever, the success for me is that it feels like 5 guys in a room nodding off. You know what I mean? It feels real. You can see them.
Yeah. It feels very organic.
It's totally real, and yet it's all an illusion. There's note by note, placed in place. It's very much like cut and pasting today on Pro Tools, but we were doing it on all those tape machines.
Yeah.
So that's a success for me, is that it sounds real.
Definitely.
Yeah, it certainly does. James, so how has your process changed over the years? So originally, obviously, you weren't working on a MacBook back in the 60s. And you mentioned the Beatles, which I kind of really want to ask you about, but you were kind of a little bit coy about that last time we spoke. So talk about the Beatles if you want, but I'm interested in your process too.
Yeah, okay. Well, 2 completely different questions.
Yes.
The work process, I suppose, let's deal with that. No, I think it's you kind of develop a style over the years, and that becomes part of your personality, really. Without going into too much great detail, that's you find something that kind of works for you, the way you can express yourself, the ideas with the way you actually, want to visualize something. That's something that comes as part of your personality, I suppose. And initially I worked in different styles and ways, experimented a lot. I've gone through different processes, I suppose, with work. But what I was most known for was working in acrylics on canvas. That's how it ended up. But I first started at using oils. But then there's a practical aspect to that. It dries very slowly. And, it doesn't photograph as well as acrylics. You pick up highlights and stuff. So for practical purpose, I ended up working in acrylics. But in the 90s, when computers first started, being taken seriously, I could see, and I was in London at the time, I could see that if I wanted to be self-sufficient, I needed to get into this technology to sort of be more completely self-sufficient, because I was thinking about moving out of London, and you needed people to photograph your work and that kind of thing. And that, with computers, really, you can do all that sort of thing yourself, be completely self-sufficient, and you can be as a musician nowadays. Absolutely. So that's really when I first started getting into it, more from the practical point of view. Okay. And nowadays, everything's digitalized. You send your work via the computer, so you don't necessarily have to work on the computer to do it, but eventually it gets digitized one way or another. So that's just the natural progress of the way everyone's used to working.
Absolutely.
And I still it depends what I'm doing. I've kind of learned to work on the computer in a digital way, but the work is quite different to if I'm doing something that, as Phill described it, is more organic. The hands-on approach is quite different. Painting something, you can achieve a painterly effect digitally, but what's the point if you can do it realistically and be more involved with the work, I think, when it's actually physical, it's tactile.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe for the next one.
But I like both, so
Yeah.
I can't, but that's me. I've always liked working in different ways, and I suppose I'm fortunate that I can do that, because depending on what I want to achieve, if it's really, the computer's fantastic for doing something very technical, for example, which would be quite difficult to do in the traditional way.
Yeah.
And very impractical as well. So it very much depends what I'm doing, is the short answer. But I like to mix it up a bit. And quite often what I'll do is I might combine a physical piece of work with, with a digital background or something. I've been working in collage, but a digital collage rather than a physical collage. And I suppose there's a very similar thing with music. You can, Phil's talked about tracks. Well, with computers, you have different layers. You overlay things, and it's very much the same thing, I think. And by doing that, you come up with results that you wouldn't have had before. So I really enjoy that aspect of computers.
Yeah, I love that.
It's a kind of love-hate thing, because, you've got to learn to work with the technology. That can be a nightmare. I remember in the early days, it's sort of pulling your hair out, was trying to work out how to get to grips with it all. But
technology is definitely caught up,
and it's all ongoing as well. It's frustrating when people upgrade things and you just have to sort of almost like start again. There's kind of frustrating aspects to it.
Absolutely.
But it's part of the job, I suppose. Just kind of try and work with it all.
Right. Maybe for the next cover, we can work outside the box and do something organic. I love the idea of that. Well,
what I've done for this album, which is what we're supposed to be talking about, always never, it is a mixture of stuff. It's kind of a collage, because there's digital aspect to it first and foremost, but I have used illustrated bits in there. Okay. So there's a bit of collage in there too. So
beautiful.
A bit of a hybrid. I'm not quite sure what to call it, really.
I love it. All right, Mr. Dean.
Yes.
How has your process changed throughout the years? Has technology made it easier, quicker?
Well,
faster, stronger?
Well, generally I retired. It's like I'm not a musician anymore, really.
You sound like Phill, but we all know what happened
But it's true. It's like I can pick my guitar up and plug it in and record on something, but it's not something I do on a daily basis anymore, and hasn't been for this decade. This century.
Wow.
Really.
Well, I'm eternally grateful that you chose to play on my track. But
I mean, I paint birds for a living. That's what I mean. So the music to me is kind of a sideline. It's something that I have to get worked up to get into it now.
Understandable.
Because I'm not doing it all the time. So I do it when I feel like it.
Can I say something?
Of course.
You're working in watercolor, aren't you?
Yes, watercolor and gouache. Yeah.
But do you get? Do you scan your work into a computer and work on that afterwards, and refine things?
Yes, well, when it's going to print, yes, I scan it because I have to send it to other people and say,
you've got to get a file, digital file.
Yeah, I've got all the digital files, and then they're tweaked just before the printing process. When it gets to book stage, then you tweak little things. But the problem is you never know how successful it's going to be on the printed page until you see it on the printed page.
No, but that's the beauty of computers. You can adjust things like color.
Yeah. And we do that. And we do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's good aspects to it.
Yeah.
Sure.
But I enjoy painting birds. It's something. Birds are my passion now these days. Going out and seeing them, and to paint them as well is just like another dimension of that, really.
Are there a lot of endangered birds where you are? Because that's one of the issues around generally, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there are definitely, there are a few endangered, not so many. I would say the most endangered birds that we encounter here are actually the migrants that have come from North America or South America because the habitat is disappearing and therefore there's less of them. And so but as far as resident birds, I mean, there are birds that we're in danger of losing habitat and stuff. I mean, I could mention a few, but nobody would know what I was talking about.
Well, I don't know if you're aware, but the birds I used on laughingstock are all endangered. We're on the endangered species list.
Right, and you also used neotropical birds, didn't you?
Well, it wasn't restricted to any country. It was just on the general list that I discussed with Keith Aspen at the time.
Right. And the live album that you did the cover of, that bird is in my yard, the blue crown motmot. I see that every day.
Wow. Wonderful.
Phill, what's your favorite book? And you can't say your own book, by the way.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Well, there's a book called Initiation by Elizabeth Hayek, which is way back from the 70s. A kind of alternative life or reincarnation type book, but I've read that a few times. I find very intriguing, so I would put that as being a book I'd take to a desert island.
Okay, lovely. James?
Wow. That's a
favorite book?
Well, without thinking too deeply about it, I've just read rather belatedly a biography on Miro, and I learned a lot of things about that. He's always been the favorite painter of mine, artist anyway. So currently I would say book on Miro.
Brilliant.
I can't remember the exact title of it, but
Robert, favorite book?
Well, it's actually 3 books because it's a trilogy.
Nice.
It's called The Deptford Trilogy by Robertson Davies, who's a Canadian author. And I've read it like 3 times, I think. Amazing author anyway. Anything by Robertson Davies is amazing.
All right, I will look that up. Okay, so James, who would you like to be stuck in a lift with? And for our American listeners, that's an elevator. Who would you like to be stuck in a lift with? If you had to be stuck in a lift.
I
mean, you got 20 minutes. Who would you like to chat to?
Yeah. John Lennon.
That's a good answer. Robert?
It is tricky because when you meet your idols, it's not always perfect.
I know you 3 have let me down. I'm telling you. But carry on.
I would have said Bob Dylan, but the thing is, I know he'd be too grumpy to get the conversation out. So.
I would love time with Bob Dylan, but I have a feeling I wouldn't come out of it very, I don't think it was very rewarding. Off the top of my head, I'll say, can they be dead? Oh yes, of course they can, because you said John Lennon. Louise Bunwell.
Okay. How about you, Phill?
Debbie Harry.
Nice one. I like it.
Okay.
All right. Well, this is topical, I guess, because considering my guests, 2 have worked with Talk Talk. 1 is a Talk Talk fan. Favorite Talk Talk I've got record, but let's say track. Robert, favorite Talk track?
Living in Another World.
Nice. Love it. Phill, you kind of mentioned it before, but...
Well, I mean, yes, definitely After the Flood is one of my favorites from them. But then mentioning the earlier albums, I think the tracks, things like Life's What You Make It, Living in Another World, they're just such great pop records, but more than pop, I mean, there's this fantastic depth and intelligence. And it's Colour Spring that sold me on the band originally anyway. So I would... it would be a toss-up between those three.
Agreed. James, favorite Talk record?
Oh, right.
Track?
Well, I would say Spirit of Eden, actually.
Okay. All right, awesome. I will say I saw them. I was lucky enough to see them play December 1981. They were supporting Duran Duran. I believe they'd been signed to EMI. They hadn't released a record. I believe Mirror Man was to be released in February of the next year, 82. They were amazing, absolutely amazing. They're all dressed in white. I had no clue who they were, but at the end of it, I was determined to find out who they were, and I've been listening ever since. Robert, where's your favorite place in the world? I guess Costa Rica's got to be up there, right?
Yeah. If it's a place that I'm not living in, I will say the Peruvian Amazon.
Okay. Wow. Seasoned traveler. Phill, favorite place in the world?
That's really tricky. Various places that I like, that I was only there for periods of time, and I don't know what it'd be like to live. Cebu Island, Philippines.
Excellent. James?
Well, I quite like where I am. I moved from London to the southeast coast, and it's my perfect working environment, really. I like it a lot. And I can't imagine living and feeling as good, if you're somewhere really hot, which usually is the obvious thing to choose, somewhere warm. But I don't find the hot weather very conducive to working, actually. And I'm being a sort of workaholic. I find the UK climate's quite good. And being as I spend most of my time working anyway, it doesn't really matter where I am, quite honestly.
Well, very true. I mean, I live in the neotropics, but I don't live in the heat. I live in the cloud forest, so it's actually quite pleasant most of the time. It's workable.
Yeah, well, there's lots of places that you think would be nice to visit, but not necessarily live.
Definitely.
It's a different thing, isn't it? I mean, it's always great to go on holiday, but then I always feel it's nice to come home.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, we are nearly at 90 minutes. I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface. Hopefully, if you're all agreeable, we could do this again, maybe next year. I would love to. I've got one more question. I kind of know the answer with Robert because we talked about this last week. So I'll ask Phill and James. Do you still have a record collection? And if so, how is it organized? Is it alphabetical, by genre, by, Phil's laughing.
No, well, I still have a record collection. I'll take this first. And it's organized alphabetically in my own idiosyncratic way.
Could you explain that just briefly?
I'll let you work that out.
Okay. All right, Phill, how about you?
Only because it's easier to find stuff that way.
Oh, I see. Okay. I got you.
I would say very similar. I do have a good vinyl collection. It's basically alphabetical, but there are a few that, a bit like James, where it isn't, but it makes sense to me.
Okay, I got you. So the confirmation that my order is on its way from England, and my most recent vinyl, I don't have a big vinyl collection, but my next purchase, Quiet Life by Japan. So Robert, you'll be pleased to hear about that. The deluxe edition.
It's the best album, so...
It is. Gentlemen, it's been an honor. I thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing working with you. I would love to work with all of you again. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your evening or afternoon. Robert, enjoy your Thanksgiving dinner.
Thank
and
you.
I will speak to all of you soon. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Philip.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Bye for now.
See you later.
Bye. I'd like to thank my guests for joining me on the first episode of the podcast, and I'd like to thank you for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. And the email address is alwaysnever@gmail.com. That's alwaysnever@gmail.com. If you'd like to stay up to date with all things Always Never, including the pre-order date for the vinyl and CD release, there will be a link in the show notes for this episode. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, goodbye.